Hey guys, as I said, I've been working on some projects here and there, and this is just the start of a couple of other ones I was working on. So, thank you. Hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow me on my IG or TikTok, or go support on Patreon. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoy. Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. Part 1. I see, said the vampire thoughtfully, and slowly he walked across the room towards the window. For a long time he stood there against the dim light of the Divisadero street and the passing beams of traffic. The boy could see the furnishings of the room more clearly now: the round oak table, the chairs, a wash basin hung on one wall with a mirror. He set his briefcase on the table and waited. "But how much tape do you have with you?" asked the vampire, turning now so the boy could see his profile. "Enough for the story of a life." "Sure, if it's a good life. Sometimes they interview as many as 3 or 4 people a night if I'm lucky, but it has to be a good story. That's only fair, isn't it?" "Admirably fair," the vampire answered. "I would like to tell you the story of my life, then. I would like that very much." "Great," said the boy, and quickly he removed the small tape recorder from his briefcase, making a check of the cassette and the batteries. "I'm really anxious to hear why you believe this, why you—" "No," said the vampire abruptly. "We can't begin that way. Is your equipment ready?" "Yes," said the boy. "Then sit down. I'm going to turn on the overhead light." "But I thought vampires didn't like light," said the boy. "If you think the dark adds the atmosphere—" But then he stopped. The vampire was watching him with his back to the window. The boy could make out nothing of his face now, and something about the still figure there distracted him. He started to say something again, but he said nothing. And then he sighed with relief when the vampire moved towards the table and reached for the overhead cord. At once the room was flooded with a harsh yellow light, and the boy, staring up at the vampire, could not repress a gasp. His finger danced backwards on the table to grasp the edge. "Dear God!" he whispered, and then he gazed, speechless, at the vampire. The vampire was utterly white and smooth, as if he were sculpted from bleached bone, and his face was as seemingly inanimate as a statue, except for 2 brilliant green eyes that looked down at the boy intently, like flames in a skull. But then the vampire smiled, almost wistfully, and the smooth white substance of his face moved with the infinitely flexible but minimal lines of a cartoon. "Do you see?" he asked softly. The boy shuddered, lifting his hand as if to shield himself from a powerful light. His eyes moved slowly over the finely tailored black coat he'd only glimpsed in the bar, the long folds of the cape, the black silk tie knotted at the throat, and the gleam of the white collar that was as white as the vampire's flesh. He stared at the vampire's full black hair, the waves that were combed back over the tips of the ears, and the curls that barely touched the edge of the white coat collar. "Now, do you still want the interview?" the vampire asked. The boy's mouth was open before the sound came out, and he nodded. And then he said, "Yes." The vampire sat down slowly opposite him, and leaning forward, said gently, confidently, "Don't be afraid. Just start the tape." And then he reached out over the length of the table. The boy recoiled, sweat running down the sides of his face. The vampire clamped a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "Believe me, I won't hurt you. I want this opportunity. It's more important to me than you realize. I want you to begin." And he withdrew his hand and sat collected, waiting. It took a moment for the boy to wipe his forehead and his lips with a handkerchief, to stammer that the microphone was in the machine, and to press the button to say that the machine was on. "You weren't always a vampire, were you?" he began. "No," answered the vampire. "I was a 25-year-old man when I became a vampire, and the year was 1791. The boy was startled at the preciseness of the date, and he repeated it before he asked, "How did it come about?" "There's a simple answer to that. I don't believe I want to give simple answers," said the vampire. "I think I want to tell the real story." "Yes," the boy said quickly. He was folding his handkerchief over and over, wiping his lips now with it again. "There was a tragedy," said the vampire. "It was my younger brother. He died." And then he stopped, so that the boy cleared his throat and wiped his face again before stuffing the handkerchief almost impatiently into his pocket. "It's not painful, is it?" he asked timidly. "Does it seem so?" asked the vampire. "No," he shook his head. "It's simply that I've only told this story to one other person, and that was so long ago. No, it's not painful. We were living in Louisiana then. We'd received a land grant and settled 2 indigo plantations on the Mississippi very near to New Orleans." "Ah, that's the accent," the boy said softly. For a moment the vampire stared blankly. "I have an accent." He began to laugh. And the boy, flustered, answered quickly, "I noticed it in the bar when I asked you what you did for a living. It's just a slight sharpness to the consonants. That's all. I never guessed it was French." "It's all right," the vampire assured him. "I'm not as shocked as I pretend to be. It's only that I forgot. I forget that from time to time. But let me go on." "Please," said the boy. "I was talking about the plantations. They had a great deal to do with it, really, my becoming a vampire. But I'll come to that. Our life there was both luxurious and primitive, and we ourselves found it extremely attractive. You see, we lived far better there than we could have ever lived in France. Perhaps the sheer wilderness of Louisiana only made it seem so, but seeming so it was. I remember the imported furniture that cluttered the house," the vampire smiled, "and the harpsichord that was lovely. My sister used to play it. On summer evenings, she would sit at the keys with her back to the open French windows, and I can still remember that thin, rapid music and the vision of the swamp rising beyond her, the moss-hung cypresses floating against the sky, and there were sounds of the swamp. A chorus of creatures, the cry of birds. I think we loved it. It made the rosewood furniture all the more precious, the music more delicate and desirable. Even when the wisteria tore the shutters off the attic windows and it worked its tendrils right into the whitewashed brick in less than a year. Yes, we loved it. All except my brother. I don't think I ever heard him complain of anything, but I knew how he felt. My father was dead then, and I was head of the family, and I had to defend him constantly from my mother and sister. They wanted to take him visiting and to New Orleans for parties, but he hated these things. I think he stopped going altogether before he was 12. Prayer was what mattered to him, prayer and his leather-bound lives of the saints. Finally, I built him an oratory, removed from the house, and he began to spend most of every day there, and often the early evening. It was ironic, really. He was so different from us, so different from everyone, and I was so regular. There was nothing extraordinary about me whatsoever, the vampire smiled. Sometimes in the evening I would go out to him, find him in the garden near the oratory, sitting absolutely composed on a stone bench there. And I'd tell him my troubles, the difficulties I had with the slaves, how I distrusted the overseer, or the weather or my brokers, all the problems that made up the length and breadth of my existence. And he would listen, making only a few comments, always sympathetic, so that when I left him, I had a distinct impression that he had solved everything for me. I didn't think I could deny him anything. And I vowed that no matter how it would break my heart to lose him, he could enter the priesthood when the time came. Of course, I was wrong. The vampire stopped. For a moment, the boy only gazed at him, and then he started as if awakened from a deep thought, and he floundered as if he could not find the right words. He didn't want to be a priest?" the boy asked. The vampire studied him as if trying to discern the meaning of his expression, then said, "I meant that I was wrong about myself. About my not denying him anything." His eyes moved over the far wall and fixed